Welcome back to the fourth and final part of our lecture on race in North America. In the previous two parts of the lecture, we've looked closely at how race shapes society in North America and how it can be used to construct identities. In this final part, I'd like to turn my attention to a particular community, Black North Americans, and see how their histories can shape our understanding of how racism and discrimination exist in the northern part of North America, between Canada and the United States. I also hope that this part of the lecture provides some important context for the film that we're viewing this week. Perhaps the most widespread and popular idea of the Black Canadian experience is conveyed in the Historica Foundation's Heritage Minute about the Underground Railroad.
Pa should have been here by now. He's 3 hours late already. Pa ain't gonna make it! One of them slave catchers got him. Something must have happened. I just know
Liza, you both made it past the border yesterday. We've all done this before.
He's our Pa. He'll be here.
Come, let's pray.
No more prayers.
Liza!
Between 1840 and 1860, more than 30,000 American slaves came secretly to Canada and freedom. They called it the Underground Railroad.
Lisa! Pa! We're free!
Yes, Pa, we're in Canada.
Approximately 30,000 slaves escaped as far as Canada on the Underground Railway, which operated roughly from 1840 to 1860, but was most active after the passage of the U.S. Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which made it legal for slave hunters to pursue fugitive slaves onto free soil. Josiah Henson, who is thought to have been the inspiration for the character of fugitive slave George Harris in the famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, provides yet another popular element of the narrative. He was born a slave, but escaped to Canada in 1830 and established a black settlement at Dawn, near Dresden, Ontario. All this fits well with our contemporary Canadian views of Canada as a welcoming and multicultural nation. In fact, the Canadian Constitution's Charter of Rights and Freedoms legally enshrines multiculturalism as a fundamental principle of our society. For many Canadians, official multiculturalism is even considered an important part of the national identity, something that particularly sets us apart from the United States. As an historian, I had often wondered whether the story of Canada as welcoming home to escaped slaves from the evil United States was more complicated. As it turns out, it really is more complex than this. Let's begin by acknowledging that slavery did exist in Canada. Black slaves were brought to Canada by the French as early as 1608, with the first slave transported directly from Africa sold in 1629. Slavery was legal in New France, and by 1759, when the British defeated the French and took over their North American colonies, there were about 3,600 recorded slaves. 1,100 were black, and the rest were Aboriginal Canadians. When Britain took over, there was no real change in the legal status of slaves. They continued to be non-persons under the law, property to be used and transferred as owners saw fit. Slavery expanded rapidly in the 1780s after the American Revolution. Many who had been loyal to Britain during the Revolution, you may recall the Loyalists from your elementary school days, migrated to Canada once the U.S. gained its independence, and they brought their slaves with them. Slavery was legal in Canada, as it was in all the British Empire, until 1833-34. It's true that slavery was in decline in Canada by the 1790s. Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe had challenged the legality of slavery in Upper Canada, though his legislation didn't abolish slavery. Instead, he proposed gradual emancipation. Children born of slaves would be free. In many ways, the attack on slavery was simpler in Canada than in the U.S. because the economy here was not a plantation economy, as in the American South. Many slaves in Canada were personal servants or dock workers, not agricultural workers. Many free black loyalists, more than 2,000, settled in Nova Scotia after the American Revolution. The Black Pioneers, the only all-black regiment that fought for Britain in the Revolutionary War, established the communities of Shelburne and Birchtown. In spite of their contributions to the war, blacks were given poor land relative to whites, when they were given land at all. As a consequence, fewer blacks were able to make a living as farmers and turn to work as laborers. This economic segregation was then matched by social segregation in communities, schools, and churches. In the late 1780s, there was an attempt to establish a free black colony in Africa. 400 left England, but the attempt was a failure, notably because of a lack of planning and disease. The entire experiment ended within 2 years. Spearheaded by British white abolitionists such as William Wilberforce, another attempt was made with the establishment of the Sierra Leone Company in 1791. Leaders from the Black Pioneers, who were in England at the time to lobby for better treatment than they were receiving in Canada, became acquainted with the plan. And on January 15, 1792, 1,200 black Canadians left Halifax for Sierra Leone, to be joined 8 years later by a group of Jamaican Maroons who had been exiled to Nova Scotia by the British. The Maroons had also been very disenchanted with their living conditions here. Significantly, the War of 1812 between the United States and British North America shifted the focus of Black Canada from the Maritimes to Upper Canada. When 2,000 escaped slaves arrived in Halifax in 1812, there was local outcry because they were willing to work at near poverty wages, reducing work opportunities for white settlers. In response, the Nova Scotia legislature banned further black immigration. In contrast, Upper Canada's Lieutenant Governor Simcoe actively promoted black immigration to the province, refused to sign an extradition treaty with the U.S., and took steps to find black refugees work. By 1800, there were already 40 black settlements in Upper Canada. Most became thriving farming communities. And by 1840, the black presence in Upper Canada extended in a triangle encompassing Niagara Falls in the east, Collingwood to the north, and Windsor to the west. We do have some sense that black Canadians did feel some attachment to British North America. In the War of 1812, thousands of black volunteers fought for Britain. The first all-black regiment, Captain Runche's Company of Colored Men, as it was known, fought in battles at Fort George, Niagara, Stony Creek, and Lundy's Lane. It's probably also true that for many of these men, 1812 seemed a war to end American slavery. Then, there was open rebellion in 1837 in Upper Canada. Growing black Canadian enthusiasm for their adopted homeland was very much in evidence here too. Within 1 month of the revolt's outbreak, over 1,000 blacks volunteered for service, and 5 black regiments saw active duty putting down the rebellion. The formation of the Upper Canada Anti-Slavery Society in 1837 and settlement help offered by some churches and social agencies also points to some degree of wider societal support for the fight against slavery and support of black Canadians. Taken together, these events contributed to Canada's reputation as the North Star of freedom and the final destination on the Underground Railroad. All of this sounds quite positive, but Robin Winks, a prominent scholar of the black Canadian experience, has suggested there's been much myth-making about the Underground Railway. He argues that not nearly as many slaves traveled along its route as has been suggested, nor were there as many whites involved as has been suggested. Following the abolition of slavery in all British territories, black migration to Canada significantly increased, but a pattern of casual segregation took root in rural areas. By comparison, in towns and cities, there was more integration. For example, in Toronto or Niagara Falls, Hamilton or Windsor, some smaller communities too, blacks found service jobs and skilled trade work, often working under conditions and wages that were on par with whites. The complex reactions toward black settlers might best be understood by looking at how one particular community came to be. Elgin was typical in terms of the challenges faced by black settlers in rural areas. It was established in 1849 by white abolitionist and Presbyterian church minister Reverend William King. Ironically, King's father-in-law was a rich southern plantation owner. When King inherited 15 slaves from him, he freed them to settle in Elgin. The Elgin proposal was for a 3,600-hectare land allotment near Chatham, Ontario. King faced fierce resistance from Edwin Larwell, the school commissioner and legislative member for the Chatham district. Larwell argued that blacks would drive down white property values, that white children would be endangered, and that blacks were an inferior, migratory people for whom Canada had no responsibility. Larwell's racist campaign came to a head in a public debate with King in front of 300 people. Few in the audience supported King, and Larwell successfully circulated a petition of protest to be forwarded to the Legislative Assembly. Then, it would seem, Larwell went too far. After securing the signatures on the petition, he went on to add several recommendations that included barring blacks from public schools and public office, forcing them to pay a poll tax, stripping them of the franchise or vote altogether, requiring blacks to post bonds, and on and on. In the end, it was this act of political trickery that hurt Larwell, and many of his supporters abandoned the campaign against Elgin as a result. After such a controversial beginning, the Elgin Association was officially incorporated on June 8, 1850. And the community quickly developed the economic self-sufficiency necessary to grow and prosper. Black migration from the United States to Canada reached a high point in the 1850s. The total population rose to perhaps 80,000, with at least half living in what we would call Ontario today. The American Civil War and the promises of Reconstruction after the war led to a massive exodus from Black Canada. Canadian authorities identified a number of pull factors: helping their brethren win the war, reunification with family and friends, and more hospitable weather even. But by the turn of the century, the African-Canadian population had dwindled to less than 18,000, and then dwindled further still. This cannot be entirely explained by such pull factors. There were also made-in-Canada push factors that certainly contributed to this outmigration: increased segregation, lack of access to schools, arbitrary firings from jobs, and there was no shortage of fear-mongering editorials in the Canadian media about the emancipated Negro in the years after the Civil War and beyond. Here you can see some of the horrific quotations that typically appeared at the time. This was racism at its worst. The key objective of this final part of the lecture was to get you to challenge the prevailing conception that Canada is inherently multicultural and less racist than the United States. I hope you can see that the history of the Black Canadian experience is much more complex than the story of the Underground Railroad. It's also hoped that from this week you'll see that race is an important factor that shapes our understanding of North America and how the people who live here interact. There are similarities or commonalities across the continent, but there are also important distinctions and differences between the North American nations. Race may have little biological meaning, but it is a powerful concept when one stops to consider how it is used to socially construct meaning. That's it for this set of lectures. We'll see you in class.